Gentleman yields back for purpose. Gentleman from California seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Have you all lost your minds? You are talking about a bill that your side wrote. This was your bill. James Lankford is the second most conservative member of the Senate. The second most conservative member of the Senate. This is your guy. He wrote the bill. He wrote the toughest border security bill that has come out of the Senate. And President Biden engaged with him, with other Democrats, to find a solution. Because they're in the solutions business. And you're in the chaos business. So let me bring everybody back to reality and give you a little history lesson. The reason you oppose the bill is not because you have any policy issues with it. It addresses everything that you've been talking about for the last couple of years. Because all I have heard from any of you is noun, verb, border. Noun, verb, border. That's all you know. And then you get a border bill from the second most conservative member of the Senate, and let me tell you why you oppose it. You oppose it because Donald Trump opposes it. That's it. That is the simplest explanation. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the correct one. Donald Trump opposes it because Donald Trump wants to be president, because Donald Trump has 91 felony counts that he's facing, and the only way that those go away and he is not held accountable is if he's president. And if the noun, verb, border plan is no longer working and he can't use that as an issue, then he may not be president. So he says, I don't support this. I want the issue, not the solution. And so you all, God, I don't know what it feels like to be so helpless to have to follow somebody like Donald Trump. Follow Donald Trump. And it's fine. I get it. You must see yourselves as so very tiny and so very small when you look at Donald Trump. And he's so big that he looms so large over you that you would do anything that he says to support him. But that is the reality. This is not a policy dispute.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
The problem with my colleague's debate is after these people are apprehended, they are paroled into the country. And so, yes, indeed, it's 5,000 people that we would allow to be apprehended, paroled throughout the United States, and that's where you are seeing this wave of migrant crime. That's where you are seeing jurisdictions like New York City. Think about their sanctuary status. I mean, I recall vividly a few things. I recall at the presidential debate when the question was asked, who would provide free health care to illegal aliens coming into the country? We all saw President Biden raise his hand. He was a candidate then, but that is a pull factor. When you tell desperate people that you're going to give them benefits and you're going to give them cash and you're going to give them shelter and you're going to give them food, I don't particularly blame the illegal aliens who are crossing the border to get those things. I blame the choices we've made in government to allow it. And the underlying legislation here at least says, I don't know if you're arrested for robbery, that there is detention and then there is deportation, that we don't have to invite all of the third world's prisons across our border into our nation and then allow the people in this country to be victims of that crime that occurs. I also vividly remember Secretary Mayorkas sitting right here in this committee room acknowledging that these people who are being paroled out into the country would indeed commit crimes. And the victims of those crimes have to be the collateral damage so that the Biden administration can allow the border to go unchecked, to go uncontrolled. And as we now try to create some deterrent to that illegal entry, it's interesting to hear my Democrat colleagues talk about just the need for more resources. Oh, if we just gave the Biden administration and Mr. Mayorkas more money, that would solve this problem. They are lawless in their use of the money they already have. They are taking what has already been authorized and appropriated it, and they've used it to disperse illegal aliens into these sanctuary jurisdictions all over the nation. And so giving them more money is sort of like saying if you have a busted fire hydrant, you can solve the problem with buckets. You indeed cannot. You have to shut off the flow. You have to shut off the flow of the people into this country. And this legislation has the very humble objective of ensuring that people who commit robbery do not stay here to do additional grave harm to our fellow.
2 minutes to my colleague and friend from the state of Texas, Chip Roy.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from California. I would note that we've only really had now 2 people speak in opposition to the bill out of the 40 minutes that's been on the floor. And that's just the reality of what we deal with here. The fact of the matter is all of this is a shell game. Last year, Republicans were presented with a bill that was supposed to cap spending at $1.59 trillion. Now we have legislation that will do no such thing. Republicans will go around and they'll talk about how they scored major wins, how they somehow delivered for the American people. The fact of the matter is, we did no such thing. We signed up for caps at $1.59 trillion. We could have had $1.56 trillion if we would have passed a CR this year that would have triggered the caps. Limit safe growth that we passed was $1.471 trillion, but we're not doing that. We're going to blow the lid off of caps at $1.66 trillion. That's what we're actually going to do. While my Republican colleagues are going to run around and say that they somehow delivered cuts by saying $24 billion of cuts off of a CR that not one member of this body could come down to the floor and explain. And I would take that challenge. If any member of the body can come down and explain to the American people in terms that they can understand, explain it, exactly what the cuts look like. Because what you'll get are things like, oh, we cut 7% out of the FBI. But what they won't tell you is 95% of that cut is eliminating an earmark from Richard Shelby because Richard Shelby is no longer here to defend his pet project building back in Alabama. And they're going to say, oh, look, we're cutting the Department of Justice and the FBI. But the truth of the matter is, we didn't get any of the major wins that we worked all last year to get. All of these things, like defunding the sanctuary cities, refusing to report criminal aliens, gone. All of these measures are not in the bill. I rise in opposition to this legislation. I hope my Republican colleagues will oppose it. We deserve to deliver for the American people the way we said we would, to cut spending and secure the border of the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman's time.
We have a do-nothing Republican Congress that has delivered no meaningful progress for the American people. Instead, it's been chaos and dysfunction and extremism. And that compares to the track record of accomplishment under the leadership of President Biden, a historic Congress in the previous 2 years prior to this Congress starting, where we got things done like clean water in every community, bringing domestic manufacturing jobs back home to the United States of America, lowering the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs, including taking the price of insulin to $35 a month for millions of Americans. It's an extraordinary track record of accomplishment. Now, we can contrast that with the do-nothing Republican Congress and also make clear that moving forward, President Biden has a vision for making life even better for the American people over the next 4 years.
Robbery is a serious offense, and those who commit such a crime, regardless of their nationality or immigration status, should be prosecuted under our laws. H.R. 7334, however, is an overly broad bill that would result in extremely harsh and unintended consequences without actually improving the immigration system. Instead, it is just another attempt to target and scapegoat migrants. Current law already generally provides that a non-citizen who is convicted of or who admits to committing serious robbery offenses would be subject to mandatory detention. But under this bill, any immigrant who is present in the United States without admission or parole and who is charged or even merely arrested for robbery would be subject to mandatory detention by the Department of Homeland Security. That is an extreme overreach. Think about a DACA recipient who was brought to this country as a baby and is now wrongfully arrested. Even though he is in a lawful status and committed no crime, he would now be subject to mandatory detention. Does that make our country any safer? Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever requested, sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the mandatory detention categories, so broadening the scope of mandatory detention will only compound the problem. But setting that issue aside, this bill also violates our bedrock principles of fairness and due process, ensuring that people have their day in court. We must protect our communities from harm, but this overly broad and punitive legislation does more harm than good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing and for shining a light on efforts to combat the sexual exploitation of children. Law enforcement experts and victims advocates have reported that advancements in technology have led to an explosion of child sex abuse material, known as CSAM, available and distributed online. Horrific photographs and videos depicting depraved acts against children are now increasingly readily available through virtually every internet-based technology, including social networking platforms, file-sharing sites, gaming devices, and mobile apps. A demand for new and more egregious images and videos drives the market for this material, resulting in the continued abuse and exploitation of children. Since the sexual violence depicted in these images and videos is a record of the victimization and suffering of a child, it is important that law enforcement make the identification of victims of child sexual abuse material a priority. To that end, Congress must provide sufficient resources and funding to those agencies and organizations charged with identifying, locating, and rescuing these children. The importance of victim identification is multifaceted. To begin with, because child sexual abuse material is tangible evidence of sexual abuse crime, victim identification enables the rescue of a victimized child. Not only are victims removed from harmful environments, but following removal, they can be connected to the services, support, and care they need to heal and rebuild their lives. Victim identification also facilitates justice for victims. Tracing digital footprints back to producers and distributors of the images, as well as perpetrators of the abuse, ensuring that they are prosecuted and held accountable for their crimes. Federal law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, combat CSAM cases through targeted enforcement actions, investigative initiatives, and victim assistance programs. While these agencies work tirelessly in their investigations to track down perpetrators involved in the production and distribution of this material, they are also committed to identifying and locating victims. However, despite their best efforts, federal law enforcement agencies cannot tackle this problem alone. The collaborative efforts of federal, local, and state law enforcement agencies, along with private and nonprofit organizations, supported by federal funding and grant programs, are instrumental in identifying and rescuing victims of child sexual abuse material, as well as bringing offenders to justice and providing essential support to victims of sexual exploitation. The 61 Coordinated Internet Crimes Against Children, or ICAC, task forces across the country have been crucial to preventing, investigating, prosecuting, and developing effective responses to Internet crimes against children. Through their comprehensive efforts, the ICAC task forces, which represent over 5,400 local, state, and federal law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies, are making significant strides in identifying and rescuing victims of child sex abuse material. But the growth of the problem continues to outpace the resources available to identify and locate victims, while law enforcement, prosecutors, the tech industry, and other organizations must continually contend with the emergence of new technologies like artificial intelligence, which further complicates their efforts. Today, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, reports that the cyber tip line has received more than 92 million reports. Its child victim identification program has reviewed over 331 million images and videos, reviewing more than 25 million images annually. And while most of the children reflected in the images remain unknown, over 19,300 victims have been identified. We should certainly commend the successes of NCMEC and other law enforcement agencies in identifying and rescuing victims, but we cannot be satisfied while so many CSAM victims remain unidentified. I hope that our discussion today will focus primarily on what Congress can do to help identify more victims, with the goal of reaching all of them. During a hearing last September, which examined the threat of child exploitation in the U.S. and abroad, we heard about the various struggles of law enforcement when confronting the edict of do more with less. When considering the plight of CSAM victims, this maxim is clearly unacceptable. The collaboration between local, state, and federal law enforcement and non-governmental entities is fundamental to addressing the complex challenges posed by investigating child sexual abuse material and identifying victims. It is our duty to fully support each of these entities and to ensure that they have the resources they need to accomplish their various missions, which undoubtedly should be centered around victim identification. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.